Hi there, I'm Davey Cretin. This is Cretin Classics. Welcome to the channel. Today I'm going to be ranking the 15 studio albums of the great American progressive rock band Kansas. Now, technically, you might think that Kansas, as of now, this is, as I'm taping this, March 2024, that Kansas have 16 studio records, but actually it's 15 because one of the records that I'm not going to be ranking today is called Always Never the Same. Always Never the Same. I'm not going to be ranking that. It's from about 1998 or so, and it's the band redoing a bunch of their songs, their own songs, with accompaniment by the London Symphony Orchestra. And it was when Robbie Steinhardt, their original violin player, had returned to the band after a long absence. And they recorded a lot of their old songs with the LSO, London Symphony Orchestra. And this is also the final album where Steve Walsh contributed original material to. There are about 3 or 4 original Steve Walsh songs on that album. So if you're a Kansas diehard and don't know about this album because it came out on an indie label, seek it out. Always Never the Same, 1998 by Kansas. Now, Kansas is a band I got into. I had heard their singles, their emphasis rock tracks on the FM rock stations, on the AM hit stations, going back to the 70s, but I had never purchased an album until the mid 80s. I remember I had just learned to drive, and I drove to a record store. I don't remember which one, and on vinyl in the mid 80s, I bought the best of Kansas. And the reason I remember this is because I stopped off at a party that my friends and I were having at someone's private house a couple of miles away from my house, and I had driven there to see how everything was going. Maybe I brought something, who remembers? And because it was the summertime, I didn't want to leave the vinyl in the car because I knew it would warp, much like my mind, some people would say. But at any rate, so I brought a bag in with a record in it, and I was talking to my friends, and they said, "What do you have there?" And I said, "Oh, it's a record I got." "What is it?" "Ah, don't worry about it." And they made me take it out of the bag, and it was the best of Kansas. And of course, they started teasing me. "What are you buying that old stuff for? It's like an old 70s band." At the time, everyone was into metal. Hair metal was big. Metallica was very big in the mid 80s. This is around, I would say, 86. And it was right before the video store I worked at actually became a video record store. So I was still buying my records elsewhere. So that is the first one I ever bought, was the Best of Kansas on vinyl. Of course, I will not be ranking that today, but that's how I got into the band. And then I heard all these deep cuts that I on the best of that weren't radio tracks that I really didn't know, and that's how I got into the band. Eventually, when I worked at a different record store, my second record store, that's when I started. We had used records. I started playing the old vinyl, started buying the CDs as they came out on CDs in the early 90s. So that's really when I got into the band hardcore, the late 80s and the early 90s. But they are a true American progressive rock band. A lot of people say there are no American progressive rock bands. There are, and Kansas was the first, and it's probably still the biggest. So for their 15 studio albums, I am going to start at number 15. And Kansas are a band where each of their albums has very good songs. Some albums are amazing, some not so much. And I would say they only have one real slight dud of an album. I wouldn't call this a total stinker, but I'm starting off number 15, Drastic Measures. That is my least favorite Kansas album. Came out in July of 1983. It hit number 41 on the Billboard chart, so it did pretty well. It was produced by the band and also Neil Kernon. And Neil Kernon is famous for producing, some of you prog heads out there know it, Queensryche and tons of other bands. So this album was a big sea change for the band. It was the first Kansas album without violin. So no violin, the sound was very different. And 2/3 of the album was dominated by songs from their new singer, John Elefante, and his brother, Dino. So Dino and John wrote 6 out of the 9 songs. And Kerry Livgren, the old stalwart from Kansas there from the beginning at this point, he wrote the other third, the other 3 songs. It's a lot of 80s type keyboard sounds, 83. It's the era of different sounds. So it didn't have that great organ sound and those classic 70s keyboard sounds. So that was a big difference. And I think this album is more AOR and rock than it is prog. There were little hints of the old Kansas that peek out on this album, but it's a very different beast in my opinion. Fight Fire with Fire is a really good song and a nice video too that was played on MTV at the time. This album also, in my opinion, contains my least favorite Kansas song, a song called Get Rich. And if I never hear that song again, it would make me happy. So at number 15, my least favorite Kansas album, Drastic Measures. Coming in at number 14, its predecessor, Vinyl Confessions. This is a better album. The first with their singer, new singer at the time, John Elefante. And the big difference here is that on this album, they used the synclavier, which at the time was a new keyboard. It was a digital sampling system that, to me, it sounded more artificial and colder than a lot of the 70s keyboard sounds, the natural analog keyboards, the Hammond organ, the Mellotron, the piano, stuff like that. I like those sounds better than the synclavier. Kansas with the synclavier just sounded a little odd, a little different. Less violin on this album. Robbie Steinhardt, the original violin player, is still here at the time, but there is definitely less emphasis for him. Less violin, and he sings one lead vocal? That's a bit of a problem for me here. They have horns, they have harmonica, but you're underutilizing your own guy. Where's Robbie Steinhardt? He's MIA on this album. So that is my problem with Vinyl Confessions. Play the Game Tonight was a big hit. I think it reached about the top 20, maybe number 19 or 18 or so. That was a big hit. That's a good song. Play On is a good song. And it's the only Elefante Livgren co-write in the whole catalog. Crossfire, Livgren's song, has some nice proggy touches, but overall this album just isn't as good as stuff before it and even stuff after it. So at number 14, Vinyl Confessions. Coming in at number 13, after not recording for a while, in 1995, May of 95, they released Freaks of Nature. This album did not chart at all, surprisingly. Did not chart. It was produced by Jeff Glicksman, who had done a lot of their 70s stuff. And 28 years ago or so, when this came out, I liked it, but I don't think it's aged as well. The album is very front-loaded. The first 4 tracks to me are probably the best songs on it. I Can Fly, Desperate Times, Hope Once Again, Black Fathom 4. Those are really good songs. It starts off really well. And I saw them on this tour, and the stuff was better and had more, let's say, balls. It was ballsier live, and they put some more oomph into it when they did it live. On the positive side, they did have a new violin player in the band at this time, David Ragsdale, who some of you prog heads might remember did a little violin solo a few years earlier with Queensryche. Around the same time, whatever. So it's good that they had violin back in the band after not having any violin since the early 80s on one of the albums I just mentioned. Also, I want to note that the final song, Peaceful and Warm, the instrumental coda, the way it takes the album out with the violin and the playing of the band, great way to end an album. So Peaceful and Warm is another really good, underrated song from this album. If you don't know it, I recommend you seek it out, you listen to it. I like the playing on display throughout the whole album, and it has some nice musical midsections that Kansas is known for. The interludes, the instrumental breaks in the songs, they're very good. Also want to mention on this album, Billy Greer's backing vocals. He was the bass player who took over for Dave Hope in the mid-'80s when Kansas got back together. And he's been with them ever since on bass and backing vocals. Sometimes he does some lead vocals. Very good singer. Undervalued asset of the band is Billy Greer, definitely. So It's a good album. It's decent. It just hasn't aged as well. It's very dry production, even though Glixman was back in the production helm. It doesn't have a lot of meat on the bones. It's very dry sound. So maybe the production also affects the way I hear it and the way I feel about it now as compared to when it came out nearly 30 years ago in 1995. And I also realized that I forgot to mention for my previous choice, Vinyl Confessions. It came out June 82. Sorry, Vinyl Confessions came out June 82. It hit number 16 on the Billboard charts. It was produced by Kansas and Ken Scott. And Ken Scott, some of you might know, famous for his work with Supertramp. So I didn't want to forget that. So I did want to mention that. Moving on to my number 12 Kansas album from November 1986, the comeback album after they'd split up a few years before. The band broke up, they went their separate ways. Steve Walsh, the singer, keyboard player, formed a side band called Streets that put out a few records that are they're more AOR than prog, I would say, just 80s rock, good 80s rock records. He was in fine voice back then. And that's how he hooked up with Billy Greer and eventually brought Billy Greer into Kansas to play bass and do backing vocals on the Power album. And Mr. Kerry Livgren wasn't in the band anymore at this time. So they got in from the Dixie Dregs, of course, the great Steve Morse on guitar. And as you know, he played with Deep Purple. Here's the shirt. It's a purple color. Steve Morse played with Deep Purple for many years and just left the band recently. And now he's back with the Dixie Dregs doing his solo work. Steve Morse is an amazing guitar player. I've seen him live a few times with the Dixie Dregs. Saw him with Deep Purple. Amazing player. So he added a lot of musicality to this band. This record hit number 35 on the Billboard charts, and it was produced by Andrew Powell and the band's drummer, who's been on every album, Phil Ehart, who, in my opinion, is an underrated drummer. What a great drummer. Seeing Kansas live and watching Phil Ehart on the drums, even though he's not playing with the band right now because he has a back issue. Awesome drummer. Very underrated in my book. So on this record, it had a really big hit single, All I Wanted. Is a really good pop rock song. And it has some nice guitar work by Steve Morse on it. But Steve Morse adds more of his guitar muscle and guitar heft to the song Silhouettes in Disguise. The instrumental musicata is very good. And Kansas didn't do that many instrumentals. Also, Taking in the View has some good acoustic guitar work from Steve Morse that's reminiscent of a song he did with Deep Purple on his first Deep Purple album, Perpendicular, in the mid-90s, called The Aviator. So I like Taking in the View. I think it's a good song. And Walsh still has his voice here. So Steve Walsh has an excellent voice. So at number 12, Power. Moving on to my number 11, The Prelude Implicit. They hadn't made a record in a very long time. Steve Walsh had finally retired. They had a new singer by the name of Ronnie Platt, still with the band, and a new guitar player, Zach Rizvi, who produced the whole album and co-wrote 9 out of the 10 songs. Now, this is a very good comeback album. It sounds like Kansas. It came out in September 2016. It reached number 41 on the Billboard charts, which, considering Kansas had been away so long, was a good charting position. The album was produced by new guitar players and co-writer of almost all the songs, Zach Rizvi, Phil Ehart, the band's drummer, and the band's stalwart guitarist who's been on every album, Rich Williams. From the beginning, the early 70s until today, Rich Williams is there on guitar. Met him in person once backstage, nice guy, big guy, imposing figure. At any rate, on this album, Rhythm in the Spirit is an excellent song, and I think it should have been the first song and the first single, but it wasn't. In This Heart was the first song and the first single. It's a good song. It's a little more, I'd say, rock, but Rhythm in the Spirit, that's a really rock and proggy song. I like that song. Another great song on here, The Voyage of 818, And the reason it's called that is because the song is 8 minutes and 18 seconds long. Another amazing prog song. Great song, highly recommended. Camouflage is good. I like that one. And section 16 ends the proper album without the bonus tracks in fine form. So that's my number 11, The Prelude Implicit. Coming in at number 10, the follow-up album to The Prelude Implicit, The Absence of Presence, from July of 2020. And as of now, as I'm recording this, this is the most recent Kansas studio record. This record didn't chart, which is strange because the previous album, 4 years prior, The Prelude Implicit, charted very well. Like I said, 41. And this one didn't chart at all. Billboard charts are very strange sometimes. This was again produced by their new guitar player at the time, Zach Rizvi, who just recently left the band, unfortunately, Philly Hart, the drummer, and guitar player Rich Williams. I like this album better than the previous album. This album adds on keyboards, taking over for David Mannion, Tom Brislin. Now, Tom Brislin is a great undervalued asset to any band he's with. He's played with Yes. I saw him live on the Yes Masterworks tour in the early 2000s. He was the keyboard player. Saw them in Jones Beach that year. He also played with Renaissance, another one of my favorite bands. Love Renaissance. And I will do an album ranking of them down the line. He also played with Camel, Meatloaf, and he has a lot of other credits. That's just to name a few. So Brislin adds a lot to this record. He co-wrote a bunch of songs, and he even sings the last song. So Tom Brislin makes this album just a cut above the previous Kansas record. Throwing Mountains, great song. Second song, really hard rocking song. Goes back to that 70s throwback, just Kansas ballsy hard rock song. So Kansas, besides doing prog, they used to do boogie in the 70s. They could do pop. They do ballads. They do hard rock, like Carry On Wayward Son that everyone knows, but we'll get to that song later. So Kansas they could do everything. They even did some blues songs early on back in the day. They did the record with the London Symphony Orchestra, so they could do anything they want. They're really good musicians. The title track here, The Absence of Presence, amazing song. That is an excellent song. And like I said, Throwing Mountains, those are my two favorites. The album might be a little front-loaded. It sort of maybe peters out a little the second half, but I think this is a very good record. So that's my number 10, The Absence of Presence. Coming in at number 9, going back to the halcyon days of yore, 1980, September to be exact. This was the last album with the original Kansas lineup, Audio Visions. It reached number 26 on the Billboard charts. It was produced by the band and Brad Aaron, and if I'm pronouncing his name right, Davey Moore, Moire. This album reached gold on the Billboard charts. It was certified gold. Reached number 26 on the Billboard charts, but certified gold. Audio Visions. At the time, this was like I said, the last album of the classic lineup. So Kansas moved into the 80s, and they, like Rush, like Yes did eventually, Genesis, a lot of the 70s prog bands knew the writing was on the wall. They had to change their sound to fit the times. So here on this album, Audio Visions, 10 songs, which for a Kansas album was a lot of songs, but like the aforementioned bands, they moved into shorter song structures. So only 2 songs clock in over 6 minutes, and the rest are all, the other 8, they're all under 5 minutes. So shorter songs here. There are still proggy touches, but they made some concessions to the commerciality of the me decade. So here, I really like the song Hold On. That got a lot of radio airplay. I think it hit about number 23 on the charts or so, on the Billboard charts. So it was nearly a top 20 single. It's a great pop rock song, and they still play it to this day in concert. A song that has been mothballed and forgotten that used to get airplay, at least on New York rock radio, Got to Rock On, is a good, short, crisp, hard rock, upbeat number. And Steve Walsh, singer, does some nice organ work on here, also a keyboard player, and added a lot to their earlier sound. And then No One Together, which is a great proggy song that's nearly 7 minutes in length and it was left over from their previous platter, but more on that in a moment. So at number 9, Audio Visions. Oh, and one last thing about this album. There is a song that Steve Walsh wrote called Back Door. Now, since this, at the time, was his last album with the band, did he write that song and was he hinting that he was leaving the band? Very interesting. Coming in at number 8, and I actually found my CD for this. Here we go at number 8 from 1988, In the Spirit of Things. Now, I like this song. I like this album, I think, more than a lot of Kansas fans. Because at the time, I was working at my second record store job, Titus Oaks in Hicksville, New York, and we used to play this CD a lot. Not just me, but my boss, George. He also played this album a lot. So Kansas, In the Spirit of Things from 1988. This is the second album with Steve Morse on guitar. And unfortunately, as much as I like this, I would say it's a failed concept record. Now, this album was produced by the great Bob Ezrin. I am a huge Bob Ezrin fan. And I didn't even realize that till recently, that he produced a lot of the albums I love. He did 3 out of 4 of my favorite Kiss albums. Maybe I shouldn't have said that, because eventually I'll be ranking the Kiss albums. He also did Pink Floyd The Wall. That's what most people know him for. He worked with Kansas. He worked with Alice Cooper, of course. Big Bob Ezrin fan. This came out October 88. It only reached 114 on the Billboard charts. At the time, there was a big regime change at the label, MCA, which we used to call in the business the Musical Cemetery of America for rock bands, MCA, Musical Cemetery of America. They didn't do that well with rock acts. They did a lot better with pop and R&B bands, MCA. Just the truth of the matter. So it was produced by Bob Ezrin, Greg Ladagny, hope I'm pronouncing his name right, and the drummer, Phil E. Hart of the band, who's been on every Kansas record. Like I said, this album still has Steve Walsh singing and playing organ, so you hear a lot of his organ, especially on the really good hard rock song, House on Fire. Walsh does some nice organ work on that song. They used a lot of outside writers on this album, so how could you have a conceptual album and use outside writers at the same time? So that's a bit of the problem here. But it was probably the record label, we need another top 20 single. They didn't get it, unfortunately, and they let this album sort of die on the vine. But this record does contain 2 of my favorite Kansas songs, underrated songs. Rainmaker, I think, is great, and Bells of St. James. Love those 2 songs. Also, in the middle of the album, there are 3 pop rock ballads, and I just think they're excellent songs, and Kansas performed the heck out of them. Once in a Lifetime, Stand Beside Me, and Counted on Love. I really like those songs. So at number 8, In the Spirit of Things, once again, just quickly, I will show the album. Coming in at number 7, finally we're moving back into the 1970s when Kansas started, but this is not their debut album. This is their last album of the 70s, from 1979, May to be exact. Monolith, the mighty Monolith, is my number 7. It hit number 10 on the charts. It actually went platinum. This album was a platinum album for Kansas Monolith. That means it sold 1 million copies, over 1 million copies. And the band produced it themselves. This album contains some great songs. On the Other Side, one of my favorite Kansas songs. Love that song. 6.5 minute monster. It's proggy, great melodies, great playing. That's a great song. Kansas went a little bit disco. A lot of bands went disco in the late 70s, early 80s. Kiss had I Was Made for Loving You. The aforementioned Pink Floyd From the Wall had Another Brick in the Wall. Part 2 with that disco, that 4 on the floor disco beat. So Kansas even did it. There's sort of a disco, poppy, happy, upbeat song on here called People of the Southwind. It's a good song, but you might say it's a little disco. A Glimpse of Home is another great mini prog epic, about 5-6 minutes from this album. There was band friction between Kerry Livgren, the guitar player, keyboard player, songwriter, another underrated player, by the way, and an amazing songwriter, one of my favorite American songwriters. There was friction between Livgren and the singer, keyboard player, Steve Walsh. This album has 8 songs. They each had to have 4 songs on it. There was another really good Livgren composition called No One Together. But Walsh didn't want 5 Livgren songs and only 4 of his songs on the record. So that's the song that was held for their next album that I mentioned, Audio Visions. So this is when the cracks were beginning to show because there was friction between band members. It was probably the usual, I don't know, I wasn't there. It was probably ego, money, maybe drugs, maybe alcohol, clouding people's minds. You get the yes men around you. You're the band, you're the band, you should make a solo album. I've said this all before on other videos. So as much as I like this album, it comes in at number 7 because there are 6 better albums than this album. Coming in at number 6, we're still in the 70s. And yes, I do have a later album in my top 6, which is a very contrarian view. Coming in at number 6 from 1975, September to be precise, reached number 70 on the charts, produced by Jeff Glicksman. It went gold. The album Mask. Masque. That kind of mask. That's the way they spelled it. From this album, one of my favorite Kansas songs, The Pinnacle. And if you haven't seen it on YouTube, Kansas were on Don Kirshner's rock concert, 1970 show that showed live performances. And seeing Kansas perform The Pinnacle, it's almost the pinnacle of their career to me. An amazing song. It's almost 10 minutes in length, and it's just a beast of a song. The playing is off the charts, the compositional skills. Amazing song, The Pinnacle. Also on this album, probably the most famous song from this album, Icarus, Born on Wings of Steel. Another excellent song, 6.5 minutes. The playing, the chorus, just is so tight on this song, and I love it. Another great song. This is a bit of a bluesy song. 2 Cents Worth. Excellent song. So Mask is my number 6. Moving on to number 5. From 1974, their debut album, simply entitled Kansas. Came out March of 1974. Since they were a new band that no one, except those people in the Midwest really, had ever heard of, the album only peaked at number 174 on the Billboard charts. It was produced by Wally Gold, and oddly enough, this album eventually went gold. So make of that what you will. From this album, I do want to mention Dave Hope, the original Kansas bass player. What a great bass player. Underrated guy. Some of his sounds that you'll hear on the 70s Kansas albums, his bass lines and his little runs, the way he comes through in the mix. Top-notch bass player, Dave Hope. Undervalued. So I didn't want to go without saying that. And of course, Philly Hart on drums. And they're definitely a great rhythm section. Undervalued, just like the Panazzo brothers and Styx. But more on that in another video. From this album, Journey from Mariabron. The ending of that song, just that lift with Livgren on synthesizer and Walsh just harmonizing along when his voice, when he was young, that is one of the highlights. That could be the highlight in the whole Kansas catalog. That just, the ending of Journey from Mariabron. Amazing. Also, Death of Mother Nature Suite. It's a really hard rock song, and it's proggy. And Walsh's organ work on this song is excellent. And Livgren and Rich Williams' guitar riffs. Great song, Death of Mother Nature Suite. Lonely Wind is another excellent song, exquisite song. And Kerry Livgren's compositional skills are phenomenal, just from the get-go, right from the jump, from the first Kansas album. So that is my number 5, the debut Kansas album. Coming in at number 4, their second album from February 1975, hit number 57 on the Billboard chart, so a big jump. Song for America is the album, the second Kansas album. The title track from this album, all 10 plus minutes of it, simply majestic. The lyrics, Livgren wrote this while flying across country and just looking out the window over the plains of America, and it came to him. And he was inspired and he wrote this song. And Song for America is a top tier Kansas tune. Also from this album, Down the Road, with Robbie Steinhardt's undervalued vocal skills. He sings a few songs on every Kansas album that he's on, of course. And he's a great singer. Deeper voice, a little gruffer, and, Walsh has the high voice, and Steinhardt's voice was more rock, more blues, but another great singer. And that's the great thing about Kansas and a lot of bands that I like. Different vocalists. Queen had it, Styx had it, Fleetwood Mac, and Kansas have it with two different singers. So Down the Road is a great song with Robbie Steinhardt singing. Also, Lamplight Symphony is epic, another great prog song. Lonely Street Rocks, and Walsh's vocals, Steve Walsh's vocals on that song are great. And the epic that ends the album, In Commudro, Hymn to the Atman, is another progressive highlight of the album. So that is my number 4 album, Song for America. Here's the surprising one. Number 3 for me, the regrouping of the original lineup with all new Kerry Livgren compositions. At number 3, Somewhere to Elsewhere, from the year 2000, came out on a small label from upstate New York. And at the time I was working at another record store. And I had a promo of it on Magna Carta Records, Somewhere to Elsewhere. It's a great album. Used to play it all the time at work, and I just fell in love with this record. And I love it, and it's my number 3. And I know that's going to shock a lot of people. It's just the way I feel. We all hear and see these things differently, so this is my number 3. It had a sequel to Icarus from the Mask album, Icarus Part 2. Myriad, another great song. Look at the Time with Billy Greer on lead vocals. Very Beatlesque type song, a little bit of a different sound for Kansas, but it works. And with Billy Greer on lead vocals and Steve Walsh on backing vocals, the call and response, amazing song. I love Look at the Time. Distant Vision is up there in my favorite Kansas songs. And I think this is a great Livgren composition. And there's another part of this song, the instrumental middle section, phenomenal. And when Steinhardt sings his part, just that part of the song, amazing. I love it. I think Livgren's songwriting on this album is on fire. It's over an hour long, so it has that thing, 10 songs in the CD age. Some people might think it's a tad too long. Also, I don't want to forget to mention When the World Was Young, where they go back and quote from one of their earlier songs from an album I'm going to get to shortly. So at number 3 from 2000, that is Somewhere to Elsewhere. And this record was produced by Kerry Livgren, who wrote all the songs on it, Phil Ehart, and Rich Williams. Moving on to my number 2 Kansas album. There are only 2 left, and I'm sure everyone knows which 2 are left because these are, quote unquote, the 2 biggest Kansas albums. I'm building the suspense here. But to move on, coming in at number 2, and I know some people might think this is slightly contrarian, but from October of 1977, peaked at number 4 on the Billboard charts. And it's gone 4 times platinum. Sold over 4 million copies in America. Produced by Jeff Glicksman, Point of No Return. And everyone knows that title track. Was played on classic rock radio back in the day. Still played, Point of No Return. They also used to play probably Paradox and Portrait He Knew, but they don't play those songs anymore. Closet Chronicles is a great, great prog song, all 6.5 minutes of it. And I love the last 2 tracks, Nobody's Home and Hopelessly Human, are amazing songs. There are no bad tracks here. They even have a short 2.5 minute instrumental called The Spider That's really good. Deep tracks of Beyond Reproach. And of course, even though I didn't write it in my notes, Dust in the Wind. And it's a classic for a reason, and it's from the Point of No Return album. And I would say it's Kansas's second best known song. Their first best known song comes from my number one Kansas album, the perfect Kansas album, in my opinion. At number one, Left Overture, came out October 1976, reached number 5 on the Billboard chart, so Point of No Return beat it by 1, coming in at number 4. This was produced by Jeff Glicksman and Kansas, and it's also 4 times platinum. This is an amazing album from start to finish. This is my favorite Kansas album. It contains The Wall, Walsh's vocal performance on Livgren's song, The Wall. Stellar. It's a stellar song. The lyrics, the positiveness, the message, positivity of it. I love it. 2 of my favorite Kansas songs from this album, deep tracks, Miracles Out of Nowhere and Cheyenne Anthem. The playing, the compositional skills, the vocals, just everything comes together. The perfect confluence of events to make this record. It is my favorite Kansas album. And I just want to mention magnum opus, the last track, all 8+ minutes of it, just Prog Heaven. The playing on there, it's got a little bit of vocals from Walsh at the beginning, and then it goes through all these instrumental sections, and it's an amazing song. So that is my number one Kansas album. And before I go, I just want to show some albums I found. This is their great live album from 78, after Point of No Return and before Monolith. This is called 2 for the Show, and you should get the 2 CD expanded version because it has 11 songs that were not released originally. So this is a great one to get. 2 for the Show. And it's a really good double CD. Got the pictures from the original inner sleeves on the vinyl. A couple of other things I found in my collection. Playlist, The Very Best of Kansas, which is a 12-song best of. And lastly, in between the Steve Morse era and before they reformed, they would tour and they released Live at the Whiskey on CD. Try and get that without the glare. Hard to do with 1,000 lights on you. There we go. And there's the band on the back. Decent live album. Unfortunately, this is when you started to notice the wear and tear on Steve Walsh's voice. But musically, the performances on here are stellar. So I recommend this too. That's it. I want to remind everyone to please like, subscribe, comment below on your favorite Kansas albums. You could do your top 5. You could do all 15 if you want. You can even throw Always Never the Same into the mix if you want. I want to thank everyone for sticking with me and remind everyone to rock out and prog on. Thanks a lot, and I will see you shortly. Take care. Bye-bye.